Bienvenue à tous. Muhammadou Kah est un diplomate et homme politique actuellement représentant permanent de la Guinée aux Nations Unies. En plus de son rôle, il représente la Gambie au Conseil des droits de l'homme. Avant ses fonctions, il a occupé diverses responsabilités dans la diplomatie guinéenne et internationale. Son travail se concentre sur la promotion de la paix, de la sécurité, du développement durable et des droits humains. Il est aujourd'hui l'invité de Décryptage. Monsieur Kah, bienvenue sur le plateau d'Africa 24. Quels sont les principaux défis auxquels votre pays fait face en matière de respect des droits de l'homme et comment cette retraite peut-elle vous aider à y répondre?
The Gambia is a country in transition as it relates to human rights. We're a country that had emerged from 22 years of authoritarian rule. So it is a country that is consolidating democracy, freedom of expression, and addressing the human rights violations that had occurred in the last 22 years. So the main challenges is the implementation of the outcomes of the TRRC, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Gambia was very fortunate to be able to conduct a very successful Truth and Reconciliation Commission where all the violations, or majority of the violations, were catalogued and the public was engaged, civil society was engaged, and the perpetrators were also engaged to confront the victims. That has been concluded, and almost over 95% of the recommendation was adopted and accepted by the government. So the government of the Gambia had taken responsibility to address the violations of human rights during that 22 years of misrule in the country. So the challenge really is getting the capacity, the technical assistance, to have the mechanism and the institutional framework to be able to address the recommendations that emanated from the TRRC. There is a need to establish a court in the country and also to respond to the needs of the victims, which is still not being addressed. So as it relates to human rights challenges in the Gambia, I would say implementation of the violations that had happened still is pending. I must say also that strengthening the institutional mechanisms in the country so that the civil society organizations are substantially involved and engaged, in addition to strengthening the National Human Rights Center in the country, so that there is a holistic participation to address the challenges. The challenges of human rights is not only a governmental issue, it is a collective issue of an entire nation.
Quels mécanismes de coopération régionale ou internationale trouvez-vous les plus efficaces pour renforcer l'application des résolutions du CDH?
A nation will have to have the courage and the conviction and the will to address human rights issues and in a contextual and adaptive manner. I mean, the implementation of the human rights resolutions should be addressed at the national levels first, but also the regional bodies. So there needs to be a coordination and alignment between what happens in the Human Rights Council in Geneva and what happens in the regional bodies that are responsible for human rights in the continent. For example, the African Union and the African Human Rights Commissions have a central and critical role to play in regional human rights violations in the country. So if you have a disconnect between the Human Rights Council resolution that do not factor or coordinate or align with the efforts and mechanisms at our regional bodies, then you have challenges of acceptability and adaptability and implementation of these resolutions. So it will be important for the Human Rights Council to do its best to coordinate and communicate and share information with the competent bodies that are at the national offices as well as in the regional offices, because there is a lot of competencies and a lot of information and findings that are done, and efforts, by the way, by these regional bodies, for example, the African Union and the African Commission for Human Peoples and Human Rights, that do not align with these resolutions. So those mechanisms are very, very important, which will bring context, which will also bring buy-in and trust among the ecosystem of human rights in the continent.
Votre pays préconise-t-il des réformes spécifiques au sein du CDH pour une meilleure représentativité des pays en développement?
Absolutely. My country advocates for supporting countries like ours, which are very small, for the purposes of inclusivity, to ensure that all voices are heard within the Human Rights Council. And a hybrid platform using digital tools was very helpful during the COVID period to allow small states like Gambia, small island states, developing countries that do not have the means to send delegates to participate in human rights debates and engagement in the Human Rights Council. These platforms were very, very helpful. So we advocate that the reform of the Council should involve making sure that all developing countries, all small island states, have an equal voice around the Human Rights Council. So we advocate the reform to include hybrid opportunities to use digital and virtual tools to enable member states that do not have the means to travel to Geneva. Secondly, it is also important that that the Council be depoliticized. Politicization and mistrust, we have to reform the Council to ensure that the membership sees themselves in the Council and believe in the credibility of the Human Rights Council, that issues around selectivity or biases or choosing some countries to be punitive and some other countries are left unaddressed needs to be reformed. That human rights is for all and for everywhere, not for a selective view. So we need to reform the Council to enhance trust, to enhance transparency, to enhance accountability and credibility, and also to reform the Council to ensure that there is smoother communication and alignment of communication between what happens in Geneva and what happens in New York and what happens into our regional bodies and our continental level organizations. So if we reform the Council in these mechanisms and to ensure that we are not selective and we treat all countries equally and fairly, then we will be moving the Council to address human rights violations everywhere.
Quelle stratégie proposez-vous pour mieux intégrer les recommandations des instances onusiennes dans vos politiques nationales?
The last point that I want to say also is the Council needs to be reformed for efficiency and effectiveness. We have to strengthen the effectiveness and efficiency of the Human Rights Council. And in that regard, we must harness the opportunities that emerging technologies brought into the workings of the Council so that we can be more effective and more efficient. I mean, our national policies have already integrated these international mechanisms and bodies. And of course, strengthening and stepping up the engagement with our legislative bodies, our parliamentarians, to be engaged, to include capacity building and transfer of knowledge and skills and the new mechanisms and mandates, and to explain to our legislative bodies and our policymakers the utility of these mechanisms. So inclusive communications and constructive engagement with all policy levels, particularly the legislation, so that this can trickle down to the community levels.
Monsieur Kah, merci d'avoir répondu aux questions d'Africa 24. Madame, Monsieur, l'actualité se poursuit sur africa24tv.com et sur l'application MyAfrica 24.